Here to worship with y'all and speak to you again. It is a privilege and an honor. We hope that Calvin and Judy are enjoying their trip and hope everything goes well with them. I am glad you had me this Sunday instead of the Sunday after next, because I would hate to be following Chris Brazell. Bad enough following Calvin, but I'll do what I can. If you ever helped a neighbor, mow their yard, or say they had a tree fell and you take your chainsaw and you go over to help them out, and as you're doing that, you end up breaking your weed eater or your chainsaw, your lawnmower, or whatever, and it costs you to have to repair it. Or say you're driving along and you see someone with a flat tire and you pull over to help them. You change your flat for them, and as soon as you get back on the road, you end up with a flat because you ran over something on the shoulder. We have a saying at our house that no good deed goes unpunished. And it seems like that a lot of times it works out that way. And it's not necessarily mentioned that way in the Bible, but I do believe that we have examples in the Bible where people pay a price for doing what's good or what's right. I'm going to start off today, we'll start off in Genesis chapter 4. Talks about Cain and Abel. I'll start off in verse 1. It says, Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. And Cain spoke to his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Now, here we have the first recorded murder in the Bible. Abel obviously had done nothing wrong. He did what was right. He offered a pleasing sacrifice to God. Yet he paid a price for doing what was right and what was good. And Cain, just being eaten up with jealousy and anger, killed his brother. The next example I want to talk about is Joseph. Over in Genesis chapter 39, there's a lot we can talk about with Joseph, but I want to focus more on the part when he's in Potiphar's house. Potiphar, as we read, he's a captain of the guard for Pharaoh. So he's a man of power and authority. And Joseph ends up in his house. And God blesses Joseph. Everything that Joseph is over in Potiphar's house, he blesses him. And Potiphar notices that everything he does just continues to get better and better. So I'll start off reading, we'll read chapter 39. It said, Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house, for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything except the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, Lie with me. But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is no greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I had lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, This is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So here we read that Joseph did the right thing. Potiphar's wife is just continually making passes at him. Day after day it says. Yet he fled. Even though he left his garment and she lied about him, he did what was right, but he still had to pay the price. And I would imagine being put in the prison, it says where the king's prisoners were confined. I'm sure it was one of the deepest, darkest places in the prison you could be, one of the most secure. And so after all that he had been through, even besides being sold into slavery and all the other stuff he had had to deal with so far in his life, I'm sure that was felt like a pretty dark place. But he still paid the price and did what was right. But he also used Joseph then for good, because as we know how the story goes, he ended up interpreting the dream and ended up being put second in command over the land, and he was able to save the Israelites from the 7 years of famine that were to follow. My next example I want to look at, found in the book of Daniel. We all know the story about Daniel and the lion's den and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. But King Nebuchadnezzar had defeated the kingdom of Judah, took them into captivity. He took the young men that were there, the ones that were full of wisdom and knowledge, and wanted to train them up in the ways of the Chaldeans for about 3 years. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among those who were chosen. In Daniel chapter 3, read that Nebuchadnezzar had erected an image of gold. And he had commanded that everyone, when they heard all the music playing, to bow down and worship this image. We'll start... I'll read in just a minute. We'll start in chapter 8. So, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. See, verse 13, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then those men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose in haste. He declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. And he answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace and declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then they came out from the fire, and the satraps, prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. So we see that God took care of them and provided for them. They did the right thing. They wouldn't bow down and worship the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was bound and determined to make them pay the price for that. Things I read, the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. I never could find the temperatures like how hot they normally got this thing, but just for easy figure, let's say it was 500 degrees. I don't think that meant they were supposed to get it to 3,500 degrees. I think it's like most times in the Bible where they use the number 7, it's used kind of just to show get it as hot as you can, just a sign of completeness. Get it just as hot as you can possibly make it. And I thought that was pretty interesting that even the men that threw them in, it consumed them, and they died from it, yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were completely unharmed. You can even tell they had been in there. So they were willing to pay the price for doing what was right, but God was able to deliver them. The next example, and where Daniel was, we don't know. He may have been, from what I read, he may have been actually exempt from the decree. He may have been off on some other mission, some other business for the king. He may have been in a place where he couldn't be seen, that maybe he didn't bow down either. Chances, I mean, I'm certain he didn't bow down and worship God, that image, but we have no record of actually where he was or what was going on. But Daniel's will be the next one that I want to talk about. Over in chapter 6, Nebuchadnezzar had been run out of the kingdom, and Darius had taken over the kingdom, and he was king, and the people were plotting against Daniel, trying to get him taken down from his position of power. And they had not been able to find anything they could trap him in as far as the business goes. So they decided the only way they could do it was through his God. So they had Darius sign a decree that for 30 days no one could petition anyone or anything other than the king. So we know the story. David goes and he goes up to his room and he prays in the window, and they see him doing this. And so they go and they tell Darius the king. And of course, the king had already signed a decree, and they had already fixed it where he couldn't change it once he had made it. So he was forced to have to take Daniel and throw him in the lion's den. And this troubled Darius greatly. Let's see, over in verse 14 of chapter 6, it said, Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Noble king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet in the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So here again we have another example, Daniel doing the right thing, yet they tried to punish him for doing what was right. He was willing to pay the price of being cast into the den of lions. But there again, God delivered him. Let's move on to the New Testament. In Acts chapter 7, we have the story of Stephen, where he is preaching. He's preaching Christ. Of course, this is after the day of Pentecost. And the crowd became angry and took him out of the city and stoned him. So Stephen, he's the first recorded martyr that we have for Christ. And he was preaching, doing what was right, and he paid the price of his life for doing that. In Acts chapter 4, we read of Peter and John. It says, as they were speaking to the people, the priests and captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of men came to about 5,000. Then on the next day, the rulers and elders and scribes gathered together in Jerusalem with Annas, the high priest, and Caiaphas, and John and Alexander, and all who were of the high priestly family. When they had set them in the midst, they inquired, By what power or by what name did you do this? Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, Rulers of the people and elders, if we are being examined today concerning a good deed done to a crippled man, by what means this man has been healed? Let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel, by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man is standing before you well. This Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. But seeing the man who was healed standing beside them, they had nothing to say in opposition. But when they had commanded them to leave the council, they conferred with one another, saying, What shall we do with these men? For that a notable sign has been performed through them is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. But in order that it may spread no further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more to anyone in his name. So they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered him and said, Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. So Peter and John were threatened and told not to speak of him anymore, even though they were doing the right thing by preaching, and they were arrested and threatened for doing that. In Acts chapter 14, we have a record of Paul speaking at Lystra. So he's preaching Christ, and the people became angry. And they took him out of the city and they stoned him. So there again, they're doing what was right. It says, the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city. And on the next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. And we know that Paul dealt with many more troubles and trials through the years. Also in chapter 16, we read about the Philippian jailer, where Paul and Silas, they're preaching, and they come and arrest them, take them to prison, they beat them, take them, put them in prison, chain them up. They're singing and praying, and great earthquake comes and loosens their bonds, and the jailer comes in, and he's ready to kill himself because he thinks all the prisoners have escaped, but they hadn't. And then Paul and Silas were able to actually save him and his family. In 2 Corinthians 11, I'm going to read some of the things that Paul endured for Christ. Verses 21 through 23 says, to my shame I must say that we are too weak for that. And whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. So Paul definitely paid a price for doing what was right. But still he did the right thing, and he paid the ultimate price with his life. At the end he wrote, he had no regrets for doing so, and we know as he wrote to Timothy, he was looking forward to his reward in heaven. The last example I want to mention is that of Jesus. We know he freely left heaven, came to this earth, did not sin, did no wrong to anyone, always did the right thing, served God, did everything to declare the glory of the Father. Yet, everything he did was right, yet he still ended up having to pay with his life. And he freely died on the cross, even though he didn't necessarily want to. He knew that's what he had to do. And he freely did that for us. In Galatians 6 verse 10, we're told, so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are the household of faith. So even though there's a price to pay a lot of times for doing good, we should still do so, especially those who are brothers and sisters in Christ. If there's anyone that has any need, you can come forward and ask for prayers or forgiveness would like to put on Christ in baptism, we ask that you do so now as we stand and sing.